The ultimate impact of closing the Department of Education on the average parent with kids in public school is nearly nil. And that's because the department doesn't hire a single teacher, they don't teach a single student. Essentially, what we're doing is closing a bureaucratic office.
Well, President Trump signed another executive order on Thursday. This time it was to kickstart the demolition of the Education Department. Here's a key moment from the White House signing ceremony.
We're going to be returning education very simply back to the states where it belongs. And this is a very popular thing to do, but much more importantly, it's a common sense thing to do, and it's going to work. Absolutely, it's going to work. And I can tell you from dealing with the governors and others in the state, they want it so badly. They want to take their children back and really teach their children individually. Probably the cost will be half, and the education will be maybe many, many times better.
Politico Playbook reported that Trump's administration says his executive order will direct Education Secretary Linda McMahon to, quote, ensure the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely, while clearing the way for its closure. So pointing to student loan programs and federal funding for, quote, vulnerable students, Politico added, quote, how exactly McMahon is going to ensure there is no shortfall while winding down the department's crucial programs remains up in the air. One fairly obvious place to start, amusingly enough, actually, might be Project 2025, which was the Heritage Foundation's annual edition of the, quote, Mandate for Leadership that the group has used literally since the 1980s to lay out a policy plan, and a detailed one, for the right to dismantle the department, for any president to dismantle the department if they so chose. The, plan for doing this is pretty clear by now. Trump is arguing that despite per-pupil federal spending increasing since Jimmy Carter founded the department in 1979, quote, there has been virtually no measurable improvement in student achievement. I'm reading from a Trump press release here in my hand. Now, it's actually interesting because pandemic-era declines, which you can see in all kinds of metrics, and you probably have seen, especially if you're a parent, or you've lived it in that case, may have been what finally gave Republicans the political will to nix the department, which they did not do in Trump 1.0. Now, there's truly nobody I would rather speak with about this than my friend Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, which, in disclosure, I am a fellow at as well. Inez has testified as an expert before Congress on education policy. She has worked in this space for over a decade, so we're lucky to have her on the show. Now, Inez Stepman, thank you for being here.
It's great to be back with you, Emily, always.
Have you ever been the victim of a data breach? I sure have, and actually recently, so let me tell you, it is infuriating. These big corporations play fast and loose with our personal information, and when they mess up, they just move on like nothing happened, and of course, we can't. Meanwhile, no one is putting in any effort to actually protect our privacy from American companies that profit off of our data. Just how easy is it to find your personal information floating around online? You would be shocked. But here's the thing, we don't have to just accept it. We can take control, and that's exactly why I use Aura. Today's sponsor, Aura, does the heavy lifting to keep you safe online. I use it. I love it. They track down data brokers who are selling your personal information and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. If you give Aura a few weeks, and when you search your name, you will start seeing fewer results, which means less spam, fewer robocalls, and more privacy. Like I said, I tried it. I really like Aura, and I've tried other similar products. This one's my favorite. Aura also keeps an eye on the dark web for you, constantly monitoring to see if your personal information has been exposed. And that's really important. If it has been exposed, they send instant alerts right to your phone so you can act fast, which is critical. And parents, listen up. Aura's parental control features actually help you keep your family safe too. Their mobile app notifies you immediately of any critical threats to your identity. Oh, and did I mention they also have a built-in VPN with 100 plus virtual locations, so I know wherever I am, I can work and browse securely. Most importantly, Aura has your back in case the worst happens. If someone tries to use your stolen data to access your bank or credit accounts, you will know right away. And if things really go south, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. So here's the deal. Stop leaving yourself wide open to data breachers and brokers. Take control. Go to aura.com/undercurrents to start your 14-day free trial. That is enough time for Aura to find out if your personal data is already out there. And trust me, you'll want to know. So thank you, Aura, for sponsoring this video. Now, I think a lot of parents around the country who don't follow politics very closely and are sort of #blessed not to have to follow politics all that closely may hear that the Department of Education is being closed. It seems that process is clearly underway in the Trump administration, and perhaps panic. Maybe their kids are in public schools. Maybe they're worried that this is going to be a significant disruption. But Inez, you've spent a long time calling essentially for the federalization of education as it's manifested via the Department of Education, at least since 1980 or 1979, to end. So can you maybe talk to, why is this not cause for panic, I guess? Maybe it's cause for panic if you're a teachers union, but not if you're an average parent in Kansas who's got a few kids in public school.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's really important to start with, and I'm even seeing more liberal outlets start as this process of winding down the department becomes more real, start acknowledging a lot of what I'm about to say. But the ultimate impact of closing the Department of Education on the average, parent with kids in public school is nearly nil. And that's because the department they don't hire a single teacher. They don't teach a single student, right? Essentially what we're doing is closing a bureaucratic office in Washington, D.C. Now, people freak out because they hear closing down the Department of Education. And I think a lot of people imagine that maybe education in the United States runs something that is in a way that's more true in Europe, which is that where the department, the central ministry of education in most European countries deals with curriculum, with directly funding classrooms, right? All the things that we think of as the meat and potatoes of the education system. That's not true in the United States. 90% of the funding for K-12 education comes from the state and local level. So ultimately what we're talking about is 10% of those monies that are now just going to go back to the states. The money isn't going to disappear in most cases here. The money in those programs is just going to send back to the states, and then the states are going to implement and send them to classrooms. So really what we're talking about is closing a bureaucratic office that does, in my view, a lot of pernicious things. And in my view, sort of, you can't even debate the fact that it has not helped the education outcomes or results in the United States. We have had those results been flat the entire time before the Department of Education, the entire time the department's been in office and incorporated the way it has. And despite a 2 times increase in the department's funds, all of those results, math, reading, they've been flat the entire time. So don't panic. This is not actually going to affect a huge number of things in your child's classroom.
Okay, so what will it affect? Because, obviously the implication of conservatives celebrating this, the Trump administration celebrating this, is that it will affect something. It will have some impact. And of course, whether you think it's positive or negative may depend on where you find yourself politically. But what is, if this is not going to affect the average student very much, what is, I guess, going to actually happen from what we know now?
So really the 2 biggest things that the Department of Education spends a lot of time doing and a lot of man hours doing are administering student loan programs, for universities. And the second thing is what I would call, frankly, screwing with the Civil Rights Act. And this is a lot of the battles that have been going back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations over how to interpret things like Title IX, Title VI, right? Both with regard to K-12 and to higher ed. That's a huge percentage of what the department actually does. So if you take for a moment the K-12 impacts, a lot of the things that department bureaucrats have been doing in the last few administrations, the Biden administration, the Obama administration before that, and then kind of with some reversals in between of the first Trump administration, has been reinterpreting various provisions of civil rights acts to then require certain kinds of compliance, either from K-12 schools or from universities or from both, right? So they interpreted the Civil Rights Act to require that schools have narrow the gap between suspensions, for example, with white and black students or black students and Asian students, right, without regard to the underlying level of doing things that would get you suspended. What happened there is a bunch of school districts got investigated, basically potentially in violation of the Civil Rights Act for equitably, so they would say it was inequitable administration of discipline, but the schools would argue, no, we're just actually we're administering discipline or suspending students based on what they do, not based on some kind of like racial quota, right? And so they went back and forth. The department ultimately prevailed in terms of having a lot of tools in the toolbox to punish schools for doing this. And what we saw is that discipline fell apart. This is like an Obama era program, but I think it's very emblematic of what the department does, which is it's a bunch of well-paid bureaucrats in Washington. The average salary is now pushing above $200,000 per person who is employed by the department, putting strings on the money based on extremely left-wing and very legally dubious interpretations of the Civil Rights Act that then goes out to all of the schools, changes on the ground practice, requires compliance, and then ultimately has bad results. We've seen that schools that were under these decrees with the Department of Education saw discipline degenerate and saw learning losses that were disproportionate to other schools that weren't under these kinds of decrees. Because of course, if you have more disruptive students in the classroom, more students doing things where they ought to be suspended and they aren't, the students, the people who suffer the most are the other students around them who want to learn and want to be in the classroom. So I think that's very emblematic of what the department actually does. You notice that what I didn't mention, right? Curriculum, funding, basic funding per pupil, funding for students in the states, right? Those are the sorts of things, paying teachers and what teachers teach. Those are the two things that people are concerned about usually when they talk about education. The Department of Education has very little impact on either one of those things.
Okay, so actually that's exactly what I was going to ask you about next. Your point about curriculum, I also wanted to ask about testing standards, because that's sort of been an area of interest for a long time. So what does the department do in terms of, like, what influence does it have at all over curriculum, and what influence does it have at all over testing standards, K through 12 in higher ed? Like, are they doing anything on a daily basis that's sort of trickling down into what's being taught in schools, and who's being tested and on what?
Federal law is very clear that the Department of Education cannot set curriculum. It's forbidden from setting curriculum. But what they do is encourage schools through the use of grants, right, to adopt various things or various programs. And the Trump administration has already canceled, just like in other departments, they've canceled a lot of those grants that were going to schools for DEI programs, for gender ideology-based, quote unquote, education, or continuing education for teachers, right? So the federal government would pay for teachers to get together, usually in some nicer locales, frankly, to do the kind of like diversity training that big corporations also did. These are the kinds of grants that the Trump administration has already canceled, and will probably continue to cancel. About $1 billion actually in the Biden administration went to these types of grants, whether they're about sort of racial balancing and DEI, or whether it's about gender ideology. There are about $1 billion of grants going out from the Department of Ed to schools on those bases. So like those things could affect schools ultimately choose, and the districts and then the state level is ultimately where state curriculum or school curriculum is actually set. But that doesn't mean that the federal government doesn't encourage various things by funding these programs, right? And that's what you could see go away. It is already going away, regardless of whether the department is formally shuttered or not. In terms of like higher ed, the huge thing is the student loan programs. The department has been jokingly called basically a bank, like a student loan bank with like a policy shop attached to it. And that's not totally inaccurate. That's what a lot of these people are actually doing, administering these student loan programs. And the administering of those programs will probably move to like Treasury, for example. Right. So it's not that the government is going to get rid of this loan portfolio. Unfortunately, it just means that the loan portfolio will move from the Department of Ed to like the Treasury, because actually, and we can get into this if you want, there's sort of this convenient lie that Washington relies on, both parties, which is that the student loan portfolio is in the black. Right.
Yeah.
It's actually funding pieces of Obamacare in our budget. And it's quote unquote funded on the total fantasy that these loans are going to be paid back in full by students whose degrees are not worth the money that schools charge them
because of the loans in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to sound like this is the libertarian lab fantasy, but the subsidies, the loans, which can be called subsidies because of the way that they functionally operate, have driven up the cost of college to insane levels. And I imagine, Inez, so have other parts of what the Department of Education does in terms of like evaluating how schools, like colleges and universities function.
Yeah, so there is no real evaluation of how colleges and universities function. I hate to tell you, like when you originally formulated the question, you asked me about like testing standards. So the federal government doesn't do testing standards even for K-12. We had a big fight over that, right? If anyone recalls the Common Core fight or the No Child Left Behind fights before that. The federal government doesn't like administer tests. We do have this NAEP assessment, right? National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's supposed to be just a matter of gathering information, right? There are no consequences attached to it. It's just, okay, we would like to know what percentage of third graders are proficient at reading, and those numbers are extremely depressing and disappointing. Administering a NAEP is not like something that will probably go away. It really is like a tiny piece of what the department does. On the college level there is no assessment of what college students are learning, and that's by design because universities would really, really not like to do, for example, an assessment where as a freshman, you take like some kind of generalized knowledge test, and then after the 4 or 5 or 6 years of university, you take that test again and see how you've improved, because it is likely that test would not reveal that universities are actually teaching much of anything to their students that would be tested in that way.
What you're asking here is our children learning?
Exactly. That's a nice W throwback there. Is our children learning? And the answer is largely no. And sadly, it's even, is our college students learning? And the answer is also no.
This process, to me, the way I've been thinking about it, and just sort of a Doge in general, it's kind of like making the decision to do open heart surgery on a patient. Extremely risky, but necessary. So does it end up going terribly wrong if, the surgeon makes a mistake and tragically? Yes, and that possibility exists, but I guess the cost benefit analysis is that it's more important, it's necessary, it's an emergency in order to sort of perform the surgery. And I guess in this analogy, to stop torturing it, that would mean the states, this is kind of predicated on the states being equipped to take over education. And, take up, like I'm reading from this Trump administration press release, it says, despite per pupil spending having increased by more than 245% over the period since the U.S. Department of Education began in 1979, there has been virtually no measurable improvement in student achievement. So that would mean the states now can create a measurable improvement in student achievement to kind of extend that argument into what has to happen. Do you think that's true? Do you think the states, even like some of these deep blue states that are wildly inefficient, as Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are now saying on every podcast, is this going to leave some of those states behind?
I don't know if I really agree with your analogy about it being like extremely risky surgery, and in part because I think the states are already doing this, right? So 90% of the funding, and I told you almost all of the curriculum decisions and things like that are already made on the state level. So it's essentially just adding the funds that the federal government oversees and putting them in the appropriate state agencies, and the states can decide how to administer those funds. They already do that with 90% of the money. So, I don't think it's quite as risky as the analogy with the surgery. We really do have a state and local run education system in America. And this is something that alternatively the left has really, despised and has tried to control around the edges with grants, like the kind of grants that I've mentioned. But fundamentally, the core responsibility of educating in America still, one, remains on parents, and two, on the states and local governments to create like the public school system. So in that sense, I don't think that it's as radical as I think some people are laying out. And in furtherance of that, you mentioned at the beginning, creating the department it's not that long ago, right? It's 1979. It gets created largely as a political deal. And Jimmy Carter picks Walter Mondale as his running mate. Walter Mondale's brother was the head of the teachers union at that time, forming a cabinet level department to oversee all of these programs that were already independently funded before the department was kind of one of his campaign promises and one of the sort of negotiations behind when Mondale was picked, right? That's how this department got created. Immediately, Reagan tried to get rid of it. He was unsuccessful. Republicans have run on getting rid of the department basically every time. So, like, if you talk to the establishment Republicans, so this is not something that like Trump is unique in doing. Like many things that Trump has done, he's taken a promise that Republicans have made to their voters and their constituents for decade after decade, and he's actually trying to implement it and do it for real. And that's really the difference here, because in terms of the goal, this has been a goal of the right for, at least 40, 45 years.
Well, lastly, Inez, you mentioned that you think the Department of Education has had a really pernicious effect on education in the United States. And just going back to this Trump administration point about how, despite spending increasing by more than 245%, over that period since the department came to be, there's been virtually no measurable improvement in student achievement. In fact, I believe, Inez, there's been some significant declines in recent years when it comes to education. So is there, I'm sure you're very happy about this, whether what happens today is symbolic or otherwise, this process is now underway. Frankly, I'm happy about it. But can you talk to us a little bit about why, like what pernicious effects we can now expect to be mitigated or eliminated?
Yeah, largely, I think it's that compliance and control, right? Because as I've said, the funding doesn't really change very much, except for some of those grants as tools of compliance and control from Washington towards the schools. But what will change with shuttering the department or substantially drawing down its staff, as the Trump administration has already done, is their ability, for example, to attach strings to that 10% of money that they send back to K-12 schools, like, oh, you must change your discipline programs, or you must change Title IX compliance so that, it includes so-called transgender identifying students, right, to make sure that boys can go into the girls' locker room, like they have access to the girls' locker room. I mean, those are the sorts of strings that were constantly being placed on schools, encouragements, you can say, that were placed on schools by Democratic administrations, by the Biden administration, by the Obama administration beforehand. So I think that's a very good thing to eliminate in terms of, and then I just want to add one element that maybe some of your listeners will be interested in to the failures that you've mentioned. Yes, we've seen test scores be flat. And then recently, of course, during school closures and as a result of, among many other things, teacher union pressure to keep schools closed way longer than anything else during the pandemic, which always seemed so absurd to me, right? Like if you wanted to choose one thing that would be important to keep running, even in a serious pandemic, let alone in the COVID-19 pandemic, it would have been schools, right? And instead, what we saw were casinos reopening before schools. That's just an aside. That's really where those dips come from, but they've been flat for a long time. But there's a different way in which the Department of Education has failed, because the creation of the department came on the heels of the Great Society, right? So a lot of promises from LBJ about closing the gap between the rich and poor in America and closing the opportunity gap between the rich and poor in America. And so one of the things that people have been tracking for a long time are academic results for the bottom 10% of income in America versus the top 10% of income, right? And back in 1965, when we were talking about, the Great Society and LBJ was implementing a lot of this, and there was no Department of Education, that gap was about 4 years of learning. And today, after the creation of the Department of Education, the doubling of its funds, inflation adjusted over the years, tons of federal programs, right? Iterations of them, No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act, right? Like all of these federal interventions in education, mostly designed at closing that gap. And at the end of it, today, that gap is 4 years of learning. And so at that express purpose of closing those educational gaps and the opportunity gaps between being born poor and being born rich in America, the federal government has been a total failure and the Department of Education has been a total failure. So even at its stated goal of doing that, it just hasn't materialized. Like none of the benefits have materialized. What's happened instead is this huge administrative explosion of bloat. Some of that, not all of it. I don't want to blame all of that on the Department of Education. I don't think that's fair. I think that states and local governments also have a tendency to staff up administrative hiring and have their own reasons for doing so. But a not insignificant portion of it is compliance burden, right? So where you see these huge increases from 1950 to more recent day, and 2015, for example, that we've had a 700% increase in non-teaching staff. whereas teaching staff has gone up something like 250%, and then the student population has about doubled, right? So we've seen teachers go up a little bit faster than the actual population of students increasing in schools. But then what we've seen is this explosion of administrative hiring, right? And a piece of that is compliance, because when you're writing to try to get these grants from the federal government, right, that there's a man-hour cost with that, and you got to hire a bunch of people to write the grants, right? So it is this like sort of bureaucratic bloat that we see not just in the education system, but in the healthcare system, and like a whole bunch of our sort of sclerotic systems in America have this pattern of administrative bloat. Well, it applies double in education, and the Department of Education has had a huge hand in sort of buttressing that problem to the point where the majority of people who quote unquote work in education and public education today are not teachers.
More good news from Inez Stepman. I guess good news in the respect that maybe this ridiculous system will soon come to an end. Inez, this was brilliant as always. Thank you so much for the breakdown.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
As a reminder, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for full premium episodes of the show. You also get a weekly newsletter from me and an email address where you can communicate with us directly so we can answer your questions on paywalled episodes of the show. Thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it, and we will be back with more Undercurrents soon.